This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey everybody, this is Razib Khan with the Unsupervised Learning podcast, and I'm here today with Anatoly Karlin. Anatoly is someone that I have known, on and off, in various forms, is the way I'll say it. For I think over 15 years at this point. He was an early blogger, and I met him in real life. I think at least once or twice. At least once when Anatoly lived in the Bay Area back about 14 years ago now. He's led a peripatetic existence since then. Actually, so have I. And so, we haven't met in a long time, but he has been on the internet, and I followed him on Twitter, and I followed his work, and he's had a few changes over the last couple of years. I want to talk to him about that. One of the reasons I followed Anatoly for a long time is he offered a different perspective from my own perspective in a lot of ways, not in all ways. And but his perspectives change; they're Protean, and so it's been interesting to see and listen, and that is why I think it's worth talking to people like Anatoly, because people who change their minds, they're pretty interesting people in a lot of ways. So Anatoly, can you tell us where you're at and what you're doing right now? Then we can kind of talk about let's start maybe February 2023. I think is that where we want to start, or 2022.
2022, if you're speaking about the start of the
the Russian invasion, was that really 2 years ago?
Yes.
Okay, because it's either happened just yesterday or forever. I don't, but we'll start at February 2022. But you talk about where you are and where you're situated right now.
Okay, yeah, sure. Just the one on myself. I'm a Russian diasporid, so I left Russia at an early age, spent a decade in the UK, then a decade in the US, mostly in the Bay Area, as Razib has just said, where we met up once or twice. And then I repatriated to Russia in 2016. And then I sort of thought that 2023 was a good time to become a digital nomad, which is like the new in thing, which is, partly connected with certain geopolitical developments that happened in that period. And in terms of what I do, I'm a long-term blogger. Like Razib, I've been blogging since 2008. I first began blogging about Russia, but then I expanded into, frankly, IQ blogging, although I wasn't really deep into the HBT sphere at that point. I was only really acquainted myself with that sphere around the mid-2010s, like when I moved to the Yoons Review. And I'm a long-term blogger, and I also my main interest right now is promoting genetic intelligence enhancement. One thing that I want to do right now, one of my main projects, is Sophia DAO, which is a decentralized autonomous organization that aims to funnel funding into this sector, much like, for instance, Vita DAO does for life extension, or Clear DAO does for cryonics.
I see. Well, I feel like you've been around, as you indicated there, for a while. But a couple of years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. A lot of us in the West, I think, were shocked. We thought that it was just kind of jaw-jawing, the usual thing. And then the invasion happened, and you were blogging along with a lot of other Russian bloggers about it in real time. And in the beginning, you were pretty bullish, I think, on the invasion and on the Greater Russia Project, or whatever you want to call it. And then you had a change of heart that was pretty radical. So can you talk a little bit about that?
I don't think it was even extraordinarily radical. I saw the preparations, so it became pretty obvious that the invasion was going to happen by early January. I've got the timestamps on Twitter and elsewhere to prove that. I assumed that when a country with 5 times the population and 10x the GDP is going to be invading a country, it's going to happen sort of quickly and pretty overwhelmingly, and the sheer scale of the disarray in the Russian military, as well as the levels of incompetence that Putin and the Russian leadership displayed throughout the war up to the present day, essentially, has been very eye-opening. Now, I mean, I was aware that, I was never sort of like a super, Putin apologist. I mean, I've had my criticisms of him. Obviously corruption, lack of science funding. If you read my stuff from the late 2010s, especially. However, I did think that Russia, for all its faults under Putinism, could provision an alternative model for relative to the West, because in the West at the time, especially if you remember, that was BLM, there was a new woke scandal every other week, and it was getting really ridiculous. And I just perceived that the West and the countries under the American sphere of influence had fallen into an epistemic trap hole from which I wasn't sure that they would ever be able to escape. And so I thought that Russia might be an actually interesting alternative model, in the sense that it was not woke. It was sort of doing some of the things that right-wingers wanted to be doing for their countries. It was relatively bioliberal, for instance, and it was there was some moves towards making the patriation of ethnic Russians easier. So many of the things that Russian nationalists have been agitating during the 2010s were in fact starting to be implemented into practice from the late 2010s or so. So my attitudes towards the Putin regime at that point improved. But that kind of all went to zero. And so the general conclusion I made after this is that for the entirety of my life, all the right-wing ideologies that I had ever sort of interacted with or had sort of observed, from Dubia World under George W. Bush to Trumpism and now Putinism, they all ended up crashing into complete failure and cringe. And they all tried in the US, obviously. It's sort of like a remarkable story. I mean, you had these sort of like people who were not like dumb people in the mid 2010s who were against wokeness, who were aware of HPT, of IQ and so on, psychometrics. And by 2020, they were sort of demanding that you remove the muzzle from your grandmother. So it's the consistent pattern is that all these right-wing ideologies have been prone to degeneration. And so I made the conclusion that probably liberalism is here to stay and be hegemonic.
Yeah. So, I mean, let me just ask you: is this part of the issue? Is that you like to be with a winner, and you called? You think that this is obviously the arc of history is bending in this direction, and you make the best of it, or just kind of curious what your take on that would be.
Well, I don't think it's. It's not cynical because if it was cynical, then the much more rational thing would be to just use Musk's much more permissive sort of like atmosphere vibe on Twitter to just shill and grift like Lord Bebo or Jackson Hinkle or whatever. And I'm obviously not interested in that. So I wouldn't say it's cynical, but it's just. I mean, I was never sort of like really into right-wing it Paul stuff. I was like my main sort of things like issues with it was wokeness. Although I realized that anti-wokeness, as it has developed now, it's frankly no better. Like, it's one thing if Charles Mulley goes to some college and gets booed by SJWs, but when those same right-wingers like deny vaccines and cause like millions of premature deaths, then I mean, these are like two slightly different scales. And the second thing is that I thought that the world would be the world would benefit from having a variety of alternate civilizational models. But frankly, the US model seems to have emerged so strong relative to not just Russia, but the Chinese challenge. It seems that there's no realistic alternative to it, and the only question is at what rate will the rest of the world adopt American best practices.
Well, what do you so what is your perspective on China right now?
I think there was some kind of turning point around 2020 when they started becoming. There was a lot of energy and like in China in the 2010s, it was growing very quickly, and I was actually bullish on China ever since 2008, simply because I realized that the country with human capital that's on the level of the Western countries, but is 5 times poorer per capita. I mean, it was basically programmed to grow quickly, and that happened. But since then, it's been so. Somebody like C says that social media are bad, and then they like introduce a law, and a third of the stock market market cap gets wiped out. Or he decides, like a boomer, that cryptocurrencies are bad, and he bans it. And cryptocurrency, which I think is a very important technology for like decentralized governance, is sort of like cut out of China. The political system obviously has become a lot worse. So, I mean, it was authoritarian in the 2010s, but now there's Xi has removed term limits, so he's going to be staying in power indefinitely, and that always carries with it the risk of entrenched attitudes, especially since when people age, they don't become smarter or more adaptive. The opposite.
Yeah.
So that's another very bearish indicator. It's become less open in general. A lot of statistical data series have stopped being published. So I mean, all of these are sort of like loosely comparable, I would say, to what was beginning to happen in the 1970s in the USSR, when growth also slowed down. And like there were more and more restrictions. Like the USSR, for instance, stopped publishing child mortality statistics sometime around the 1970s because they had sort of stopped falling as like they became known.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know if we're entering an era of stagnation in China, but definitely a lower dynamism, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it seems like Xi's idea is to stabilize, reinforce. So, one of the issues, by the way, I think Dick Otter talks about this extensively. There's an issue in America. I actually fell prey to this, I think, too, where Americans tend not to take the Chinese at their word when it comes to their ideological, their communist ideology. In terms of, we just kind of think, oh well, it's all fake and all that stuff. But actually, Xi does take it seriously. He is an ideologue, and it does look like he is willing to sacrifice economic growth, dynamism, all of the things that people in the West take for granted as their birthright for ideological conformity, and this idea that actually, again, it's hard for me to believe, but I think it is probably true. They actually do think socialism will somehow win in the end, and so it causes the Chinese regime to behave in ways that we find perplexing.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I agree that China is a a Marxist-Leninist state. There's a pretty good book, although it's that decade old, but I think it made the point quite well, called the Party, which goes on at length. Like even back then, the level of control that the CPC exercised over the military, for instance, it was even greater than in the Soviet Union. So, I mean, there were signs that this kind of turn was going to happen.
All right, so
It was.
yeah, so I mean, speaking of ideology, I do want to pivot back to Russia because you know you're Russian, you know a lot about Russia. Um, I mean, does Russia have the Russian regime? Does Putin? Do they have a real ideology? Because I understand that some people say that right wing intellectuals like Dugin have influence and all this stuff, but a lot of people say that that's not even true. That you know, people might put out some stuff about some sort of ideological program, but really, the interest of the Russian state is just the interest of the Russian state, and it's very results oriented rather than some sort of theoretical framework. What would you say to that?
I wouldn't say it's strongly ideological in any real sense of the word. I mean, frankly, the very fact that people ask extensively about what is Russia's or Putin's ideology kind of illustrates that. Personally, I thought that he was obviously in the 2010s there was a turn towards conservatism, and in particular, the issue of gay rights was picked as a wedge issue to differentiate the Russian brand from the West. Firstly, it was mostly symbolic, but like a decade ago, 15 years ago. But especially since the war began, it's become quite a lot darker because, well, I mean, you now have raids on gay nightclubs and stuff like that. But I don't really think that it's something that's very deeply felt. It's I would say that it's more still more cynical than anything else because Russian society isn't super conservative. There was some talk about, for instance, banning abortion, but it seems that they've decided against moving forwards with that, simply because opinion polls say that 70% of people would be against it. Regarding Dugin, what you have to sort of understand about him is that it's basically two things. It's first, it's performance. There's a large measure of performance art to the entire thing, a lot of love. I mean, the guy was into national Bolshevism. He was one of its two founders, alongside Eduard Limonov. Then he did some weird Warhammer 40k type chaos LARPing, and before moving on to this sort of like new orthodox fourth position stuff that he is promoting now. So I think a person who sort of like flips ideologies like this in this kind of postmodern way, that doesn't indicate any sort of like extremely sort of strong ideology per se. And the other thing is that I would say that the other way to look at it is to view Putin, and Putin especially because he determines a lot of what goes on in Russia, is that he's basically somebody who doesn't use the internet, but somehow managed to become radicalized by right-wing Facebook memes. Because he keeps on talking about parent one, parent two, even though it's like really not an issue at all in Russia, or even like unisex toilets. Like nobody like cares about this in Russia. It's sort of like a total non-issue that he randomly brings up as talking points occasionally. And it's very weird because it is, however, a big issue in the sort of like, the sort of right-wing American ecosystem of Karl Tucker and all these people. And so what I think is that the people around Putin sort of became exposed to this ecosystem and thought it would be a good talking point to sort of like bring to Putin's attention, and he kind of ended up drinking the Kool-Aid. But although this is more my personal opinion of what happened.
Well, I mean, is he he's been in power. I mean, he's been in power for your whole adult life, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. I mean, how connected is he to kind of the pulse of Russia? Like, how popular is he? My understanding is he's remained broadly popular. He's not unpopular, right? Even though there were
Yeah.
protests. And so, how connected is he to what's going on in Russia today, or is he kind of a little bit isolated? He is 71. I want to point that out.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, there's two things. Objectively, he is popular. Like the approval ratings are something like official approval ratings, 80%. That's what he got in the elections. There was fraud, but that added 10 or 15 percentage points. He would have gotten 70% without it. So yes, I mean those ratings are sufficiently well known. There's To the extent that the war affects Russians, it's uh, still on a voluntary basis. The Russian population is 5 times bigger than Ukraine's, so you don't have coercive mobilization plus gangings like Ukraine is resorting to. Like the war is done through volunteers who are paid about 5x the average Russian salary, which is a big deal for people from impoverished provinces. And in terms of the economy, what the war has before the war, you had 8 years of monetary and fiscal austerity ever since the end of the commodity super cycle in 2014. All of that has gone by the wayside since the war began. So you have a lot more spending, including on social spending, and looser monetary policies. So living standards have actually been going up during the war, paradoxically, despite the Western sanctions. So it's not surprising that, well, Putin has conquered territory. The war hasn't sort of personally impacted the vast majority of Russians who are not actually fighting there. Those who are doing so voluntarily. And living standards have on average sort of slightly gone up, if anything. So it will be surprising to expect realistically a sort of like a collapse of Putin's authority or approval ratings. Obviously, if there are going to be military reversals, then that's going to change. And if the economy runs out of steam, which is also a possibility, I mean, it's overheating right now, then that could also be a potential problem a year or two further down the line. But those are speculative scenarios for now.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think from a Western perspective, the sanctions and all this stuff, and what a minimal impact it had. Just out of curiosity, I know the Russian state, but some people have defined it as a petro state. Is it still highly commodity driven, or there's been this talk of skilled workers fleeing to places like Georgia and Armenia. Just like what is the general sense in Russia about that sort of thing?
Well, according to the best estimations, about 1 million people left Russia. I mean, I'm due to my milieu, I'm more exposed to this than most other people. But my milieu includes transhumanists and life extension people and crypto people. So obviously, these are vastly overrepresented amongst the ranks of people who are likely to leave in the first place. So a lot of them have left. But if you're talking about Russia as a whole, 1 million people. But if you're talking about educated IT workers from Moscow, for instance, then it might, who are like under the age of 35, then it might be more like 10% of them. So if you're talking about people from that sort of crowd, but who are also into weird politics, then more like a third. But at the grand scale, like from a bird's eye view, 1 million people isn't a lot. Regarding the question of I mean, Russia is a hydrocarbons based economy. I mean, it's got skilled workers, but there hasn't really been a lot of sort of like innovation-driven companies of the sort that you have in the US or in the developed European companies, and it's ultimately a matter of political economy. Like the political economy is such that businesses are wary of making big capital investments because, well, some of the Western companies left and some of their assets have been nationalized and just given to members of the Kadyrov clan. So, I mean, if you live in such a political economy, then you'll be wary about making big investments or building anything very complex for the long term. And
Yeah.
I think that this, like the developments in the past 2 years, have really opened my eyes to like the intrinsic weaknesses of the Putin regime, and why sort of convergence to it can sort of survive and as a middle income country that derives rents from hydrocarbons, but I don't think it can make the final push to being an actual developed economy with developed holding industries under this current system.
Okay, so a last Russia question. I'm actually curious. I want to get your take. What I remember Russia. Well, I mean, I never went to Russia. I've never gone to Russia, but in the 1990s, we in the United States were basically told that Russia had liberalized, and there was free speech and there was democracy and all these other things. And I know that in Russia, it wasn't viewed exactly the same way. Can you talk about what your perception, the people growing up in Russia, what their perception was of the 1990s?
Extremely negative, obviously, and I think people entered the 1990s very optimistic about the about capitalism and about friendship with America. If you look at the historical opinion polls, approval ratings of the U.S. were something like 80% around 1992. But then there was. Probably people blame the U.S. too much. I mean, obviously, I would not call the U.S. a good actor as regards Russia's development in the 1990s. So, I mean, we know about the broken promises with respect to NATO expansion. I mean, we know of like the geopolitics, the complicity in sort of like I would say undue political influence and interference in the 1996 elections on Putin's side. But at the end of the day, the people who who looted the Soviet national assets, they were Russian citizens. They did not come from Mars. They came from the Soviet system itself. And so there's only so much that you can realistically ascribe to the US. I mean, at the end of the day, it was like the people around Yeltsin who decided that rapidly privatizing Soviet state assets, which the Soviet people had like labored to build over the decades, and to give them away at preferential corrupt prices to insiders, to guarantee a Yeltsin victory against the communists in 1996. That was, well, I mean, they were like Russian citizens. So, I mean, you can't really complain too much about that. But I mean, it is what it is. And I think the whole experience with the 1990s did considerably disillusion Russians with free markets, and with although they weren't really free markets, obviously, because when you give like there weren't proper privatizations. When you privatize things, the idea is you do it transparently and fairly, and do it at fair prices, instead of like under the table. But it is what it is, and the Putinist political system directly emerged out of the Yeltsin era. Probably the main reason that Putin was selected to be the successor to Yeltsin was because he informally promised the Yeltsin family immunity against prosecution. And that's a commitment that he actually maintained.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to pivot to some of your writings that talk about where you are oriented right now. But I saw this piece, this post on acarlin.com. So if you go to acarlin.com, you have links to a bunch of things. But so this post, I saw it retweeted. It's from December 31st of 2023. So pretty recently, 6 months ago, pretty literally. I saw it retweeted by Matt Iglesias. So this is someone who it's well known that the Biden White House reads Matt Iglesias. So someone in the Biden White House saw your post, probably, why jail is programmed for all rightoids. So
yes.
that's interesting to me to think about that. Talk about this post, like why you wrote it, and like what it generally says.
So it's actually the fourth post in the series. The first one is the introduction, intellectual structuring. And my basic argument is that, as I said, all the right-wing ideologies I have ever experimented with or interacted with have failed, have come crashing down to the ground in a humiliating fashion. So it was driven by two things, essentially. First, the desire to actually, distance myself from some of this, and also to clarify some things, because even back when I was sort of like a dietoid myself, there were a lot of things that I disagreed with like it Polish right-wingers. I mean, we were both pro-vax, for instance, and pretty considerably disillusioned by, I would say, by popular attitudes towards coronavirus and the denialism that was happening around that. So the first part was the Soypil Manifesto, where I actually clarified what I used to believe specifically, as opposed to what some people, many of them not favorably disposed towards me, such as at National Wiki, say that I believed, and also to clarify what I believe now. The Z of history addresses like my history with Russian nationalism and my current perspectives on Putinism and what it really is. And the fourth part is the one you mentioned, which is why jail is programmed for all dietoids. Which is I mean, you might sort of like criticize me that I might be overcorrecting. It's probably a legitimate argument. But I mean, I think you do have to, like, if you're going to be on a diet, you like. I do think that you have to engage with many of these arguments and the so-called human capital problem of the diet. Nathan Kofnes recently had an entire article just about that. And the problem is that if you systemically attack people who are less smart, who are less conscientious, who are more corrupt on average, have personal problems of a lot of the time, then you're not going to get a very functional or prospective movement. And I think that the reality just keeps spelling me out, like what the conservatives talking about. The wokes really did go overboard. They could have focused on that. They could have sort of focused on the Biden administration's like its real failings, like anti-capitalism, like anti-crypto attitudes, for instance. But what have they decided to do? They decided to focus on abortion. They've decided to focus on Obama's gay trysts, on Hunter Biden's cock. I don't think that's going to be a very prospective thing. I mean, they went really big on Israel. I mean, I think we have some differences in opinion on Israel. But I mean, I'm not going to go into that. But the thing is that I don't think it's a good idea to uncritically embrace Israel, and in particular sort of start signaling against freedom of speech, which is frankly what a lot of the IDW people have been doing, like signaling against the right to protest. Because frankly, I mean, those same people, they are quite vulnerable to it as well. I mean, those things that they're sort of like nationalizing right now, they, with time, as we see time and time again, they are then most likely going to be weaponized against those same people, like in another few years, like with the all those anti-terrorism laws that were introduced under George W. Bush. I mean, a lot of them were subsequently used against the right-wingers, right? So even from a cynical, strategic perspective, I don't think that's a smart idea.
Yeah, so I'm gonna just give my general take on what you're observing here. Over the last year, so 2012, and we're talking about politics and global politics. You cannot ignore the United States, which is 800-pound gorilla. Our culture influences a lot of things. In 2012, the Republican Party's nominee was Mitt Romney. Now, Romney is obviously kind of like attempt to do Reaganism for the 21st century. Yes, he's tired. He has a lot of tired ideas. He's throwback. but he was a successful professional in a very meritocratic business. Private equity, like it or hate it, and a lot of people hate it. But in any case, he ran Bain. He was a partner at Bain, and Romney's people and Romney's campaign was oriented, towards more well-off professional Americans. And if you look at the demographics, it was pretty evenly split. What's happened with the pivot towards Trump, uh, again, like I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's just descriptively true. The influx of working class people with like lower educational qualifications, lower human capital endowments, basically has transformed the cultural affect of the American right, and really, really overbalanced it, overloaded it towards a populist, somewhat crass element culturally. Trump himself is obviously grew up very wealthy and is very wealthy, but he has an ability to connect with working class and like the popular masses on a crass pop culture level that's really pretty much unmatched by any other politician, I think, recently. But the downside of that, obviously, is the the head of the snake is shrinking. The American right and the Republican Party in particular is losing a lot of college-educated voters, a lot of the cultural and social elites who are either going neutral or shifting to the left. And so, I mean, that's from a fine-grained American perspective, that's what you're talking about. I think Anatoly, like, you would say like this is kind of happening on a global level, though, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I call it the dietoid international. I see it very much in evidence. So, like the Russian right-wingers and nationalists connect much better with Trumpism, like all this like biolabs, anti-vax stuff. They lap it up, like obviously in a way that they wouldn't have with like republicanism a decade ago. And I don't think it's something specific to Russia. Like if you look at like far right European parties, I mean it's Trumpism. It's like the obsession with the WEF. I've seen it from Japan. I've seen it with India. You're probably familiar with HM Broth on Twitter. He has a lot of examples of this kind of stuff from India.
Yeah.
And I find it extremely kind of ironic and amusing that in a sense, Trumpism. I mean, I've got to give Trump his due. I mean, I'm not sort of like it comes off like that, but I don't have Trump derangement syndrome. I don't really care about this stuff. Objectively, he's a very funny guy. If you don't think that Trump is funny, then you're probably a square. And it's a successful cultural export of the U.S. Just like yet again a total American culture victory, like in those civilization games, right? Like all the dietoids around the world, they have ended up speaking the language of Trump.
Yeah, totally. American culture is to some extent global culture, world culture, which is easy for us Americans, but it's a little more difficult, I think, for some of the people in the rest of the world, especially older ones, who see their youth. I mean, I've heard weird things that like there are people in Canada. Well, actually, like, Lauren Southern, online, conservative, right wing personality, and she said something about her dad, her Republican dad, and I replied to her. I was like, Lauren, didn't you grow up in British Columbia? And she's like, isn't your dad, British Columbian Canadian? She's yes, but basically, in Canada, American politics is just a shadow over everything, and
Mm-hmm.
it's
Yeah.
not unreasonable to say that her dad is a Republican because he aligns with that party in the United States. Whereas, look, I mean, I'm supporting. I mean, I personally support the Conservative Party probably if I had to pick. Whatever it's called now with that the guy that eats the apple. But I don't know much about Canadian politics besides a few cutouts and caricatures.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas like our politics seems like very live to the rest of the world. But
Yeah.
so
Well, yeah, I mean, if you listen to Russian political discussions around elections, I mean, nobody's saying is going to discuss the fake Putin elections where he gets his 80% and whatever. Like everybody is discussing the American elections. And you might say that, okay, Russia, it doesn't have real elections. So, but Like even if you go to many European countries, especially smaller European countries, then yes, I mean a lot of them are more interested in American politics than they are in the local politics. And that's actually, you can criticize that, but it's a valid viewpoint because the US, well, it's got $25 trillion in GDP, 340 million people. It's just vastly more important than any other country except China and possibly India in another generation. I mean, that's it. So it's like the only politics, pretty much, that's relevant. Also, especially in light of its cultural dominance.
Yeah. So, we've been talking about a little bit or alluding to, your views in the past, but obviously you have a lot of views on the future, and you've always been kind of a futurist. So there are some conservatives, who are, I don't know, they're like Russian Orthodox or whatever, and they think they want to. It's a joke, but it's kind of true. They want to bring back the Byzantine Empire. That like they're really looking into the past. You've always been kind of future oriented. What is your vision for the future right now? Because I still get a sense you're still into transhumanism and all those other things, and like we were talking earlier, like you're interested in human intelligence and all those other things as well.
Yeah.
Which is
Okay.
by the
So
way,
yeah.
by the way, I want to say, like, you pivoted away from the right, but I'm not sure that you're really on the left. You're more like a neoliberal globalist or something, right?
Yes. I like the WEF. Yeah, I like the UN, the World Economic Forum. I like Klaus Schwab. Yeah. And I like crypto because I do think that I've become a lot more disillusioned with nation states in general. I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with the whole network states thing, but I genuinely do think that if previous experiments at enclavism and breakaway republics were largely doomed because there was no sort of like a way to get the involvement from the rest of the state system to recognize them. I think that with crypto, what you have is that as the world becomes more digital, and I don't think this trend will stop, you have another bigger percentage of world economic activity moving into the digital realm. And the best way to secure value in it, the most rigorous framework for property rights in the digital realm, is the blockchain, decentralized smart contract blockchains, such as Ethereum, for instance, or Bitcoin, although Bitcoin doesn't have smart contracts. And I think that in general, like it would be a much more effective world that could be focused more down network states, because with traditional states, you have 200 of them, and they have big barriers to entry and exit. They're not competitive. They tax about 40% of world product, but they offer a very subpar product relative to like market choice in governance could actually provide. And I basically think that a prospective world of, say, 200,000 network states, as opposed to the current one of 200 nation states, would be a much better way of provisioning that. And like if I have any kind of ideological long-term futurist kind of vision, then that would be it. It's not sort of like Bidenist neoliberalism or whatever per se, but more like the sort of like the centralized, radically globalist future. That's where people can associate with people who share their values, as opposed to people who found themselves on one side of an arbitrary border drawn by uniformed bandits centuries ago, and many of whom like often just hate each other. Like, you have in the country, you have fascists, you have communists, you have Democrats and liberals, and they all hate each other, right? So why do you have to force them to live together? That's kind of my perspective on politics. As regards futurism, I think that obviously AI is a big thing. There's like a really cardinal question over whether timelines are short or not. Like if timelines are short, the prediction market suggests that they might be short. As in, like if you look at Metaculus, last time I checked, AGI projections are for 2032 or something. Then with AGI, a lot of, by definition, pretty much, all the other issues become irrelevant, and then it's just a question of whether like AIs are sufficiently aligned with human interests, such as not dying and like becoming ascending to godhood. and so a lot of other stuff becomes irrelevant essentially. Like concerning yourself with culture wars between rightoids and leftoids, or concerning yourself with the details of like to whether some fly speck village in Donbass belongs to the Russian state or the Ukrainian state. It's such a idiotic waste of time in this sort of like historical period, in my opinion. Like if you're sort of like looking to do high impact stuff, then I think you should be going into AI or adjacent fields, such as, for instance, if AI doesn't pan out, it would be probably pretty important to augment human intelligence. And actually, if you have smarter humans, then they would have a higher chance, logically, of solving AI alignment. I mean, that's one of my core arguments for why human intelligence enhancement is good. It's like all the biotech stuff is actually relevant if AI timelines are super short, like a decade or less. But if there's going to be another generation or two before AGI, then some of that stuff might become extremely relevant and could even make the difference between a positive singularity or a negative singularity. So those are sort of like my broad thinking. So if you have any particular questions or objections, then file away.
Yeah, well, I just want to like put some definitions out there because you threw out a lot of terms, and I'll go back. Network state, obviously, kind of pioneered, promoted by Balaji Srinivasan, who currently is living in Singapore. He has a book of that name, and he's doing conferences related to that. So this is something that's becoming realized in IRL. That's his project, and other people have taken it on and pushed it forward, like you. I also want to say AGI, artificial general intelligence, and that's basically the idea that we will create artificial life, artificial consciousness, something that's analogous to human agency in the world that is from, computation. And so that's what we're talking about, which is a big, it's a big, maybe I would say ontological leap. I don't know, just in our understanding of the universe and our place in the universe. So it's a lot of big concepts. I guess, you're in London right now, and like who are you interacting with in general? Are you interacting with technologists, with philosophers? I know there's at Oxford there was a group that was interested in effective altruism, and then there's also the EAC group, which is effective accelerationism as opposed to effective altruism. And I need to define these things for some of the listeners because a lot of people here are not aware of all these things. But so there's all these like factions out there. Like where are you aligned? Like what's your positionality?
Frankly, I'm probably midway between EAC and EA because I think that a lot of the EA people are a bit too neurotic on AI, whereas the EAC people, they are just sort of like they worship the thermodynamic gods, and I think that like some of the basically some of them don't even believe in AI. So like based Bev Jesus, for instance, he's actually against radical life extension. He also thinks that after AGI, humans could sort of like continue to exist and settle like space and so on, even though it seems sort of very dubious that in the world with AGI, that biology would remain super relevant, let alone do space colonization. So I mean, I think EAC has like severe epistemic limitations, whereas EA is perhaps a bit too neurotic over AI doom. But I mean, these are awful generalizations that I should make clear generalizations. Personally, what I'm sort of looking to get myself involved in, and I'm getting involved in myself, is mostly biotech, human intelligence enhancement space. I mean, we know that Jonathan Lumley is interested in. He recently released his second edition of Creating Future People, for instance. I'm also actually writing a book right now provisionally called The Biosingularity, where I make the case for human intelligence enhancement. So, I mean, it's sort of, well, I hope to have it out by the end of this year. That's sort of like my second major project after Sophia DAO. And I spent the first third of this year actually in Prospera. There was a pop-up city called Vitalia. Nicholas Anzinger and Lawrence Ion. Lawrence Ion is with Peter Dow, which is the Dow that's involved with radical life extension. And the idea was to create a pop-up city that just keeps going on this sort of like libertarian pro-business paradise in Honduras, the island of Roatan, called Prospera. And its slogan is making that optional. I mean, I'm sort of not involved in life extension myself, although I ideologically absolutely support it. But my sort of like, but my main project is human intelligence enhancement. But I do think that the two sync with each other pretty well, especially considering that, like, if you live for much longer, then eventually you run out of new things to do unless you're smart. You actually need to be sufficiently smart to find interesting new stuff to do. If you sort of like are interested in understanding the universe beyond the limits of your current intelligence, and conversely, it's possible that radical life extension just turns out to be this intractable problem that's sort of like beyond the limits of current baseline humans to solve in principle. In which case, perhaps the current generation of scientists fail to solve it. But if we start augmenting human intelligence and start producing a new crop of people who are radically smarter by 2050, then there could be another second go at it.
All right. Yeah. So it's a lot to think about, a lot to take in. I want to close out.
Just by the way, since you live pretty closely, I mean, feel free to visit Italy as well. I mean, I think you'll enjoy it because there's usually quite a lot of interesting people. That's okay. Another thing I like network states a lot is because, as I said, when you sort of associate based on values and shared interests, it's generally speaking going to be a more interesting and vibrant community than one where you have this sort of like enemy, which defines modern living arrangements in big cities. Like, okay, one thing if you like live in a community, in a village community or whatever, but that has its own downsides, right? It's like even Marx was talking about the idiocy of village life. So yeah.
Well,
it's kind of the best of both worlds.
Well, the issue is it's like an intentional community, right? Commune in a way, is what you would say, and those have their upsides and downsides too. But you know what you're getting. So you're in London right now. I have not been to England since 2010. What is going on with England? Like, what do you think about that country? Because here's an English speaking country. It has actually like two really good universities and some other. I mean, Oxford and Cambridge, everyone knows, but places like Edinburgh, Leeds, it's got some other good universities too. But it's failing in all sorts of ways. It's getting left behind. And do you see? I mean, I know London is where the economic productivity, the finance is, and whatnot. But do you see it in other ways? What is your perception of what's going on in England? I mean, conservatives are going to get destroyed.
Yeah.
But I'm probably going to post this after they get destroyed, actually. But it doesn't seem like Labour has any alternative vision. It seems like the country's in a rut. Tell me what you think about that.
Well, I understand pretty bearish on the UK. I mean, in fact, it should be in a strong position because, as you said, it does have a strong R&D sector. It's an English-speaking country that's sort of like positioned geographically between the EU and the US, so it should be a sort of like a powerful conduit and human capital magnet on account of that. And it actually does attract quite a lot of good researchers. But the problem is that it's culturally anti-capitalist. As you say, the conservatives, it's sort of they don't actually have any of the benefits of conservatism like the US has of skepticism towards government. The Rishi Sunak has recently just literally proposed the introducing national service, so essentially forcing 18-year-olds to wipe the bums of pensioners for free. So this is sort of like this doing a quadruple lock on pensions. So it's basically this pensioners party, essentially, part of the gerontocracy. And Labour, I mean, they're not going to be doing this stupid stuff, but they're going to be doing other stupid stuff. They are like even more anti-free freedom of speech than the Conservatives. And they sort of like are going to probably increase state spending even further. The British have this irrational attachment to the NHS, which is like has worse outcomes than the free market US system. But they worship it for some reason. So I'm not super bullish on the UK, even though theoretically London should be doing really well, especially and England as a whole. But if you look at the statistics, the UK has been growing in per capita terms at about Italy's pace over the past decade, and Italy is well known as the sick man of Europe in economic terms. So like Germany on average is now significantly richer. Like if you look at London, it's basically a median West German town, and the rest of the UK is significantly lower. The US is obviously a lot higher across the board. Yeah, I mean, given its sort of like core advantages, like as I said, pretty respectable human capital and R&D base, so good performance on the Nature Index of science productivity. It should have a lot of companies, a lot of startups, but for some reason, well, I mean, for obvious reasons, like whenever they get sufficiently successful, they just relocate to Silicon Valley, and that's it. Yeah.
Actually, go on, Anatoly.
Yeah. By the way, one thing I sort of wanted to randomly raise with you. You never talk about Bangladesh, and I think it's interesting. And Bangladesh is interesting to me. It's that it's probably the country that people know the least about in per capita terms. So it's got 170 million people, but it's sort of like visibility. Like the popular culture is close to zero, which I find to be quite remarkable for a country that has a population that's now bigger than Russia's, which is like half the Eurasian land surface. So yeah, I mean, I was just sort of like wondering if you could comment something about Bangladesh and perhaps even mention something about its attitudes towards Russia, because as I gather, the USSR played a pretty critical role in enabling Bangladesh independence.
So I can talk a little bit about that. I guess like that's a fair point. Usually when I when I talk about Bangladesh, I talk to my friend Carol, who's Polish, but he lived there for 10 years or something, and he can speak Bengali better than me. He can read and write. I can't read and write. But so in terms of Russia, I mean, I think this is like India and Bangladesh are both the same. The sentimental attachment, whatever the geopolitical interests are today, and they're not, both India and Bangladesh are trying to take, I think, a middle path geopolitically, and I think that's actually fine. Obviously, there's some self-interest there, but the sentimental attachment to Russia is, I think, pretty strong. Not necessarily Russian communism, but or Soviet communism, but Russian advisors, just like economic aid, and obviously during the Civil War, which turned into a war of national liberation in 1771 that you're alluding to, where the government of Pakistan has always been Western aligned. And so the United States was backing Pakistan. People who are listening can Google, there's a lot of tendentious stuff about the Bangladesh genocide. I think the numbers are exaggerated some, but, broadly it gets the directionality correct in terms of the Nixon administration was backing Pakistan and was very, very wary about Bangladesh, which was founded. Its name is still the People's Republic of Bangladesh, which shows you its geopolitical orientation. The Awami League, the current dominant party, basically the monopoly party since 2008 or so, is a nominally a left wing socialist party, and it comes out of that tradition. So obviously Russia, you were talking about, is more conservative socially, at least, in terms of its rhetoric. So it's not quite the left wing standard bearer there was. The ideologies are all scrambled. So it's not really an ideological affinity. I think it is just an affinity of like life and cultural history of a lot of people in Bangladesh. The older generations, younger generations probably, don't have as strong of an attachment because, Russia's not been as major of a factor. In terms of why Bangladesh is not as culturally prominent, and so I think the context for I think there's something in the background that maybe is a question why you would ask is Bangladesh has actually done economically pretty well. It is going to leave the least developed category in 2026. And it depends on whether you look at PPP and other things, but Bangladesh is now competitive with India. India is actually, like, I think, taking the lead again this last year or two. After the pandemic, India has bounced back really fast. But Bangladesh and India are basically, they're racing with each other. It's not a race, but they're racing with each other. Pakistan's been left behind, which is a big change from the first, 30 years of Bangladesh's existence, when it was very much of a basket case. And that, but India and Bangladesh have different ways that they're economically developing. India has a diversified economy. It has a huge internal market with 1.4 billion people. And, there's these like regional centers of dynamism in Gujarat, in Mumbai. South India is developing. And also it has a very, very well-developed service sector, information technology. People already know that. Bangladesh has really developed more on a Southeast Asian model of going towards industries like textiles and just basically throwing labor inputs from across, the lower, the bottom 90%. And so it hasn't really developed. It hasn't really developed an independent or dynamic elite intellectual or intelligentsia that is definitely in English. I can tell you my podcasts and my traffic. It shows way more traction usually from Pakistan than Bangladesh. And that's because even though Pakistan, on average, its median income is lower now, it still has a intelligentsia that is, interacting with the West, engaging with the West. India has the same thing too, actually. So a lot of Indian intellectuals would feel more comfortable, left-wing Indian intellectuals, with left-wing Western intellectuals, than they would the people in their own country. Bangladesh doesn't quite have that because its economic growth has been quite populist, and so what it's done is increase the media, and it's been pretty broad based, which is good. That's what India has wanted to do, but India has some socialistic permit Raj regulations that prevent that. Bangladesh is an ethnically homogenous state. It's ethnically homogenous and it's religiously overwhelmingly Muslim, but the Islam, you would it's like overdone that it's a moderate Muslim state. But unlike Pakistan, people in Bangladesh, I don't know how to like explain it. Pakistan's not really a nation state, as a lot of the listeners know. It's multiple different ethnicities, multiple different nations in one state, and so they need Islam to like tie everything together. With Bangladesh, almost everybody is Bengali. So Islam isn't needed as a national glue, and so it's an important part of the national identity, but it doesn't overwhelm the national identity as with Pakistan. And that's kind of helped, I think, in terms of just kind of centering the nation as like an economic, entity that interacts with secular NGOs and really does want to orient towards China and Southeast Asia. So I think that's part of it. From what Carol has told me and what I get a sense from my relatives, they do see themselves as Asian, and they do want to look to the East because they see that as the model. But that obviously turns them away from any integration into the Western, intellectual, cultural, and media sphere. And also, I mean, Pakistan has a great cricket team. There's all these other things that are associated with Pakistan. Also, among Bengalis, Tagore was the first Nobel Peace, Nobel Prize winner from Asia. Among Bengalis, ethnic Bengalis, it's more the Hindus of the West. Although Tagore himself is his family had estates in what is today Bangladesh. So it's one Bengal, but it's split between India and Bangladesh. So West Bengal is now economically and on social metrics like infant mortality and other things actually inferior to Bangladesh in a lot of ways. And it has been. It's been communist ruled forever. So you have a border where the Bangladesh side is actually a little bit more affluent now, and a lot of my relatives just go to Calcutta to like shop and do other things. But they're Bangladeshis are the number one tourists in India, I think now. So there's a lot of back and forth there. Unlike Pakistan, which is polarized because Pakistan thinks it's a geopolitical entity. But in any case, so you have this issue though where a lot of the cultural elite were stripped during partition, and it's never really come back. I think part of the issue is during the 70-71 war. The cultural elite that remained, they were actually proactively targeted by the Pakistan military because they were seen as being able to produce propaganda, right? So there's all sorts of reasons that are going on, but it's kind of I guess what Bangladesh is it is developing pretty fast. It was actually it was like the economically the most robust large economy, if you want to say it, in the world during COVID. It famously kind of like bucked the trend, partly because I think they were just like, whatever, we can't afford this, so we're going to keep going.
Yeah, logical,
yeah. So it's it is. I think you're bringing up an interesting point, and I don't know. It's kind of a mystery. I have a friend who's a Bangladeshi economist, Bangladeshi American, and he said it is going to be a problem where Bangladesh may get caught in the middle income trap because it's not investing enough in its human capital. And there are people in India. I know people in the United States who get educated in the United States that go back to India. Mm-hmm. That's not really a common thing for people from Bangladesh if they get graduate degrees to go back to Bangladesh. I think Bangladesh is trying to change it, but it's not a common thing. There isn't enough. There aren't enough slots for the professional managerial class there, and so they're trying to work on that. So right now, what they're really doing, it's like a blue collar nation, is one way I would say it. I have said this on the podcast before, but my relatives who are pretty well off there, they do complain. It's really hard to find servants now because the class of people that would provide servants, they send their daughters to work in the textile factories now. So
that's a good problem to have.
Yeah, it's a good problem to have. I mean, its total fertility rate, I think its total fertility rate just dropped.
Fallen quite rapid.
Yeah, I think it's dropped below. I think it's dropped below 2. Just like it's 1 point in 2021. It was 1.98, so it dropped below 2.
Yeah. Just like India, actually, approximately.
Yes. Yeah. Although with India's a little higher, but it's because India has high regional variation, right? So India has multiple nations. So if you go to the south, it's like Southern Europe.
It's like 1.3, and if you go to like the north, like the
Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, which are huge, and so they're although Bihar dropped to 3 until relatively recently. Bihar, which is like I think it's like the second or third most populous state. It's right next to West Bengal, so it's in the northeast, right? But Bihar had social statistics and social metrics that were like quite like Pakistan. And Bihar is like almost as populous as Pakistan. So it was this weird thing. Like India has a Hindu Pakistan within it, and then it has places like Mumbai or Kerala that are just like totally different culturally. And so so when you compare Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India, they're not proper comparisons because Bangladesh would be one nation within India. To some extent, Pakistan too, although it's much more ethnically diverse, right? So
obviously it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I mean, India is sort of like a ethnic heterogeneity. So you have Kerala, which is like very specific, ruled by the communists.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say also, it's like because you're bringing up a real point. Bangladesh, because I don't know what the Army League did, but they actually like really, really increased internet penetration over the last 10 years. So it has a massive amount of mobile phone internet penetration. But also, I'll tell you, it just shows you like it's the parochialism. I'll say I get very little traffic from Bangladesh. I get a lot from India, although it's much bigger, but I get like considerably more from Pakistan. So it just shows that they're reading stuff in Bengali or they're watching things in Bengali. So it's a very, very parochial nation in that way. So there's a lot of good things happening in it. And, a lot of my friends have said that I should be more bullish on Bangladesh and stuff like that. So
is K-pop a big thing there, like in Indonesia?
So My understand yes, yeah. My understanding is East Asian pop culture, which has always been present with anime and other things like that, is increasing. And one thing that I've noticed is I do have relatives that still go to Europe for vacation, but they're often going to Singapore or Hong Kong or Japan or even China now. And that's just because, there's a lot of things to do and they're closer. And, the prestige has kind of pivoted away, I think, from Europe. I mean, there's still a lot of Bangladeshis that are going to Europe, though, attempting to, be refugees and all these sorts of things. I mean, those are people that are not really working class people. I think these are basically middle to upper middle class people who don't find the professional opportunities are appropriate. There's still a fair number of Bangladeshis that are, I think, illegal in India, although that problem is decreasing partly because of population pressures and partly because of the economy, right? So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's kind of good that you don't hear about Bangladesh. It's kind of bad that you hear about Pakistan, a country like that that's developing. It really should not be focusing on its geopolitical heft because, you want to get rich first before you,
Yeah.
engage in these luxury goods of global status competition,
Yeah, and so do you have any theories of why Pakistan went from being much richer than Bangladesh, and I think richer than India as well, 40 years ago?
Yeah. It was. It
Being-
took a lot.
Is it
Yeah,
because of like the landlords, like which is like semi-aristocratic
Well,
caste that?
Yeah, so what you're alluding to is like they never did land reform. So they have a very calcified feudal economic system. But I think the biggest issue, if I had to guess, would be their country, their state invests in their military so much, and their military is an economy in and of itself. It's a subculture in and of itself, and I think that prevents like efficient allocation of capital. Pakistan wants to play with the big boys. It wants to play with India, but it can't. It's literally like when it's like an eighth the population of India. Its economic output is obviously going to be concomitantly less. They did what the Soviet Union did during the Cold War. They threw everything at the military, but that results in deficits in all sorts of other areas of society. So it hasn't economically advanced in the same ways. It hasn't increased its human capital endowment, and so it's starting to fall behind. And it seems like they're just okay with it. They're very, very ideologically fixated on, this class of civilization, all these other narratives. And, when you're like fixated on the past, that means you have no future. I think it's a fundamental problem that Pakistan has. It's too focused on its own history and not focused on the history that it's going to make in the future in terms of, economic development. So Bangladesh doesn't have geopolitical ambitions. I think its goal is just not to be bullied by its neighbors, in particular India, and to deal with the Rohingya crisis. These are small ball things compared to what Pakistan wants to do. And it has good relations with China. It has good relations with India. The Awami League has good relations with India. The opposition Conservative Party does not, but that party is pretty marginal right now. So that's a moot point. Whereas Pakistan has ambivalent relations with most of its neighbors. I mean, China is its main ally, but even there are groups within Pakistan that are very, very anti-Chinese. The rebels in Balochistan. The Belt and Road could not really operationalize in Pakistan the same way it should have because of political strife, right? Like political strife, and military expenditure are killers for economic growth and stability. And Bangladesh, for all its problems, and it is a quasi-democracy because, I would say the Awami League, a good analogy would be Orban and his movement in Hungary, where it's democratically popular, but, they use the leverage of the state to amplify their popularity. But it is actually popular because she's brought stability and economic growth since 2008 out of the financial crisis. Right now, Bangladesh is suffering a little bit from the higher interest rates and its debt servicing. And so India is in a better position because India has a massive internal economy, and so it's not reliable on exports, right? But it's actually making it through it. It got a loan, and partly that's just because it has foreign currency. It has like a dynamic economy, and so it's going through this pretty effectively, I think. I don't know what's going to happen after the current Sheikh Hasina, the current prime minister, who's been a political figure since the 1970s when she escaped assassination. Her whole family was killed in the 1970s. Her father was the father of the nation, kind of the George Washington of Bangladesh, but she was in England or something. And she's been around forever. Her sons don't seem like they really want to inherit her role, like, the Gandhi family. One of her sons, like, lives mostly in the United States, is married to an American woman, so I think they're going to have to figure out what the succession is, but, maybe that's good, having like two parties alternating seems like a relatively successful recipe for a nation state, even if you think a nation state is a little outmoded. I want to say, like, the whole nation state idea, I think it is a point well taken, that the nation state as we understand it today is really only a couple of centuries old, and there's no reason that it needs to be the inevitable end of history, social political organization, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, my view is that the nation state mostly emerged out of the exigencies of fighting and winning wars. So, like, a lot of the actual increase in state capacity accrued due to the need to sort of like increase the financing of armies in the early modern, and that thing has thankfully become quite a bit less relevant since the first half of the 20th century.
Yeah.
I mean, like, one of the questions I suppose you could ask is that if geopolitical tensions continue to decrease, like in the long term, which is sort of like a bold claim at the moment, but I don't think that recent events have disproved it. Then I mean, it sort of like it will become an increasingly germane question, are nation states the political constructs best suited for the digital era?
Yeah. All right, man. It was great conversation. We've been talking for a while, and we touched on a lot of things. People. I'll put the links to your Twitter and your website and everything online. Like, looking forward to your book. Good luck on it, and good luck on your travels and your journeys. And let's hope the geopolitical stability, is sufficient for you to smoothly hop between network state and network state.
Okay, thank you. That's
All right.
appreciate that. Right.
This podcast for kids